I can still hear the sound of his footsteps echoing through the house as he left. James, my husband of 50 years, walking out the door with nothing but a suitcase and a simple, "I'm leaving you for her." The words hung in the air like a thick fog. I stood there, frozen, unable to process what had just happened. But it wasn't just the betrayal that stung. It was the sudden realization that I had been a fool to ever trust him so completely. His secretary? Of all people. And yet, as I looked around at the life we'd built, something inside me clicked. He thought he could take everything from me. But I already had a plan. Before we dive back in, let us know where you're tuning in from. If this story resonates with you, don't forget to hit that subscribe button because tomorrow, I've got something even more special lined up just for you. James had just turned 50, the age when most men were preparing for retirement or at least slowing down, but not him. He had always been hungry, for more money, more power, more recognition. I had seen the signs, of course. The late-night meetings that never made it into the calendar. The sudden gym membership and new wardrobe. The increasing number of business trips that required no itinerary. But I had buried my suspicions because I loved him. Because I wanted to believe that after 5 decades together, we were unshakable. We had met when we were barely out of high school. He was charming in that boyish, arrogant way that girls find irresistible when they're young and foolish. I fell hard. When he proposed at 20, I said yes without hesitation. We didn't have much back then, but we had dreams, and I had him. We moved into a cramped apartment above a laundromat, and I worked 2 jobs while he studied business. Every dollar we earned went back into his dream, to own a company, to build an empire from nothing. And we did. Together. I was there from the first cold call, the first rejection, the first small contract. I did the books in our kitchen. I answered phones while our son cried in the crib. I hosted client dinners in our tiny living room, cooking from scratch and smiling like the perfect corporate wife. When his business finally took off, I didn't ask for a thank you. I didn't need one. I thought love was enough. The company grew. What started as a humble supply chain firm transformed into a full-fledged logistics empire. Warehouses, fleets of delivery vans, international contracts. It was all under our name. Or so I thought. Somewhere along the way, I went from being his partner to being his shadow. He started introducing me as the homemaker, as if I hadn't built this business with my own hands. My name slowly disappeared from the paperwork. He stopped asking for my opinion, stopped sharing the numbers, stopped including me in strategy calls. And I let him. Because I believed in him. Because I believed in us. The first time I saw Vanessa, I knew something was wrong. She was hired as his executive assistant just over a year ago. She was young, too young, with high heels, glossy lips, and a laugh that never sounded sincere. I remember thinking how odd it was that she sat in on board meetings. Assistants don't usually do that. But when I asked James, he shrugged it off. "She's just good at anticipating needs," he said with a smirk. I should have known then. I should have pushed harder. But instead, I smiled and nodded, because I didn't want to seem jealous or insecure. I didn't want to admit that I was afraid of losing him. I spent our 50th anniversary alone. He told me he had an urgent trip to Singapore, some logistics emergency that required his presence. He sent flowers to the house, white lilies, my least favorite, and a card that simply said, "Rain check." No, I love you. No mention of 50 years of marriage. Just 2 words. That night, I opened a bottle of wine and sat on the patio alone, watching the stars and wondering if this was how it would end. If this was what half a century of devotion earned me. Then came that morning. He didn't even wait for me to pour my coffee. He just stood in the living room, suitcase by his side, and said it. "I'm leaving you for her." No emotion. No hesitation. Like he'd been rehearsing it in front of a mirror for weeks. My heart didn't break immediately. No, it was slower than that. Like the slow cracking of ice underfoot, thin and dangerous and cold. I didn't cry. Not right away. I sat in silence for hours, numb, my hands folded in my lap. I looked around the house, our house, and saw his fingerprints everywhere. The painting we bought in Rome. The dining table where we hosted Thanksgiving dinners. The photo albums stacked on the bottom shelf, each page a reminder of a life I thought we shared. But now every memory felt like a lie. And then, amid the silence, something shifted. A strange, unfamiliar calm settled over me. My fingers stopped trembling. My breathing slowed. Because in that moment, I remembered something he had forgotten. I owned the company. Not in name. Not on paper. But in the one place that still mattered, the charter. Years ago, before the IPO, before the expansions, before the board members and the lawyers, James had signed everything over to me. For tax purposes, he said. You don't need to worry about it, he told me. It's just on paper. But I did worry. I read every line. I met with a lawyer friend in secret and had him verify it all. I made copies. Stored them in places even James didn't know about. Not because I didn't trust him, but because I had been poor once, and poor women don't forget. They prepare. Quietly. He had no idea that I had kept every original contract, every transfer of ownership, every clause that protected me from exactly this scenario. To him, I was just the housewife. But in reality, I was the quiet architect of our empire. The one who held the keys to the kingdom. And now, the king had decided to abandon his throne. That night, I poured myself a glass of the champagne we were saving for our anniversary. I stood in the kitchen, toasting to the woman he thought he was leaving behind. But he wasn't leaving a helpless, heartbroken wife. He was walking away from the owner of everything he thought he controlled. He just didn't know it yet. And that was fine. Because the next move would be mine. The days that followed James's departure were strangely quiet. Not the sort of silence that begs for attention, but the kind that seeps into the walls, into your bones. I didn't leave the house. I didn't need to. I let the world go on spinning while I sat still. Listening, thinking, remembering. There were no frantic phone calls from him. No messages asking if I was okay. I imagine he thought I'd crumble. Maybe that's what he was hoping for. That I'd lie in bed for weeks, devastated, so he could parade her around without guilt. Instead, I got up every morning and took my tea in the study. The one room in the house he never cared for. He said it was too cold, too cluttered. But I had always loved that room. The oak desk, the tall windows, the way the light hit the shelves at just the right angle. That's where I'd kept the originals. Locked in a drawer with brass handles. Paper that didn't scream power but whispered it with elegant force. Every clause, every asset division, every signature he'd carelessly scribbled thinking it was just another formality. His laziness, his arrogance. That was my shield now. The company charter was clear. Ownership of over 60% of the controlling shares had been transferred to me a decade ago. At the time, it was a tax-saving strategy, and he had insisted it was temporary. But like many things in his life, temporary had turned into forever. He forgot. I never did. James didn't call me, but I heard about him. Small-town gossip has long arms and an eager mouth. It wasn't long before whispers reached me. James and Vanessa, spotted at our favorite restaurant. James and Vanessa, moving into a condo near the marina. James and Vanessa, attending a charity gala in clothes I likely paid for. Some people pitied me. Others assumed I'd been blindsided. But what none of them knew was that while James was out enjoying his freedom, I was preparing to remind him exactly what he had walked away from. I hadn't told our sons yet. It was too soon. David was overseas, working with a humanitarian group in Kenya. Marcus had just become a father himself. I didn't want to taint their joy with their father's betrayal. But the truth would come out soon enough. And when it did, I wanted it to come with proof. With precision. Not as a victim's sob story, but as a woman's quiet reckoning. It was around the fourth day that Vanessa called. Not James. Vanessa. She had the audacity to dial my number from what I assume was James's phone, because his name lit up on the screen. My thumb hovered over the decline button, but curiosity won. "Margaret," she said, in a voice that made my skin crawl. I hope you're doing okay." I didn't answer. "I know this must be hard for you. But James didn't want to hurt you. She exhaled, trying to sound compassionate. "We fell in love. These things happen. These things." I finally spoke, my voice calm. "You mean leaving your wife after 50 years without a shred of decency or closure?" "Yes, I suppose these things do happen." There was a pause. I imagined her sitting in my chair, touching my belongings, thinking she'd won. "I just wanted to say," she continued, "James is starting to go through the company books, and there seem to be a few discrepancies. He asked me to call because he's a little confused about some of the documentation. Your name on the ownership records, for instance." I smiled, and though she couldn't see me, I made sure she felt it in my voice. "Tell James the first said hello. And tell him not to worry, those aren't discrepancies. That's just ownership." I hung up. The next morning, I went to the office for the first time in months. It had changed, modernized, sterile. The front desk staff barely recognized me until they looked at the ID badge I still carried. Then they stood straighter, eyes wide. Margaret Davis, majority owner, was still in the system. Vanessa wasn't there that day, or maybe she had the sense to avoid me. But James was. Sitting in his corner office, legs crossed, sipping coffee like he hadn't lit our lives on fire just days earlier. He looked up as I walked in, and for the first time in years, he looked surprised. Genuinely, stupidly surprised. "Margaret." I closed the door behind me and sat down across from him. "You left me," I said plainly. "And that's fine. I'm not here to talk about us. I'm here about the company." His mouth opened, then shut. "I don't know what you think." "I'm not thinking anything, James. I know. I know you forgot what you signed. I know you didn't expect me to come in. And I know Vanessa has no business asking about ownership papers." He stiffened. "You left," I continued. "But you left the wrong person. You thought I was just a housewife with memories. But I'm the majority shareholder of this empire. The one you built on my back. And I've spent the last week deciding whether to push you out quietly or publicly." His face changed then. He leaned forward, angry, defensive. "You're bluffing." "No," I said softly. "You just weren't paying attention." He didn't yell. James never yelled. But his jaw tensed the way it always did when he realized he was no longer in control. "I suggest you lawyer up," I added. "Because I'm not the woman you walked out on. Not anymore." When I left the building, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Power. Not spite. Not revenge. Just the steady weight of being the woman who still held the reins, long after the man beside her let go. That evening, I poured myself a second glass of wine. The first was for peace. The second, for planning. Because now it wasn't just about the betrayal. It was about the reckoning. I didn't expect James to back down immediately. He wasn't that kind of man. He was the type to press harder when cornered, to wrap his arrogance in faux charm and wait for others to flinch first. But this time, I wasn't blinking. The day after I confronted him in his office, a bouquet of white lilies appeared on my doorstep. No card. Just a cruel callback to our last anniversary. I didn't touch them. I left them outside until the petals browned and curled in the sun. Like everything else he had once brought into my life, they were beautiful only for a moment, then they turned rotten. It was almost amusing, watching him scramble. James had always thrived on control. He had controlled every conversation at dinner parties, every staff meeting, every family decision under the pretense of leadership. But now he was in uncharted territory, and I could see the cracks forming. He tried to access certain financial accounts and found them blocked. He tried to issue directives to the board only to learn they required dual approval, mine and his. The more he tried to move freely, the more he realized the walls had shifted. What he once assumed was his domain was, in fact, mine. But I wasn't rushing anything. No, this had to be done right. Cleanly. Completely. Quiet power isn't about chaos. It's about precision. So I called my lawyer, Frances, a woman I had known since we were both young and underestimated. She didn't need to say much when I explained the situation. She simply asked, "Are you ready to end this?" "Yes," I said. "But not before I teach him exactly what he walked away from." We began the legal preparations. Frances filed the necessary documents to formally activate my majority rights. She reviewed the shareholder agreements James had been so eager to ignore. She helped me initiate a motion to audit recent financial activity, particularly the increased executive expenditures over the last 8 months, most of which were linked to Vanessa's travel, wardrobe, and dining. I hadn't just come for personal justice. I came to expose everything. In the weeks that followed, I returned to the company, not as a visitor, but as its rightful leader. I walked the halls he had once strutted through with his chest puffed out. Employees who used to nod politely now stood when I entered. Whispers turned into smiles. Respect returned, slowly but surely. Some of them had wondered where I had gone. Others had assumed I had retired. But when they saw me in the boardroom again, steady and composed, they understood. I had never left. I had simply been watching. Vanessa, to her credit, tried to maintain her facade. She played the innocent card, smiling in the corridors, sending "just checking" in emails with too many exclamation marks. But she stopped showing up to the board meetings. She must have known the whispers were growing louder. People were talking. The finance team began to leak concerns about her discretionary spending. A junior HR associate approached me nervously one afternoon, saying Vanessa had tried to manipulate the payroll system to include a mysterious monthly bonus. By the time I scheduled a formal board vote to restructure the executive leadership, James knew he was in trouble. He called that night. I let it go to voicemail. Then he called again. And again. Finally, I answered. Not because I owed him anything, but because I wanted to hear how desperate his voice had become. "Margaret," he said, the confidence in his voice cracked and thin. "We need to talk." "I don't think we do. I know you're angry." "No, James," I interrupted calmly. "Anger is what I felt when you walked out. This is just evolution." He was quiet. "I made a mistake," he finally said. "You and we had a life. I got lost, Margaret. I thought I wanted something different. But I didn't realize what I was giving up." A bitter laugh escaped me. "You didn't realize? James, you didn't lose me. You discarded me like a clearance item and thought I'd sit here and mourn while you started a new life with someone who doesn't even know the value of your silence." He sighed. "You're being dramatic." "No, James. You're being foolish. And now you're just late." I ended the call and sat in the dark for a long time, staring at the fireplace we never used. He had always said it was too much work to light. Too messy. I lit it that night, just to see if it still worked. It did. A week later, the board convened. I presented my motion to remove James as acting CEO. The vote was unanimous. Not a single abstention. The finance reports, the misuse of company funds, the erosion of trust, it all laid bare before the table of men and women he once ruled over. I didn't gloat. I didn't smirk. I simply stood, thanked them for their time, and walked out. James was still technically a shareholder. But his power was gone. Stripped by the very clauses he signed without reading. Overlooked. Underestimated. Dismissed. I should have felt triumphant. I should have wanted to dance in the parking lot. But what I felt was deeper than that. It wasn't about revenge. It was about reclamation. The home we once shared was still mine. I didn't change the locks. I didn't need to. He never came back. I heard that Vanessa left him 2 weeks later, once she realized his title no longer came with the perks she craved. He moved into a modest apartment near the airport. Fitting, for a man always running. David came back from Kenya that month. When I told him the truth, he looked stunned, but not at the betrayal. At me. "You're amazing, Mom," he said, hugging me tighter than he had in years. Marcus was more reserved, but I saw the pride in his eyes too. "You never even flinched," he said. I had flinched, of course. Many times. Alone. In the dark. But what mattered was that I stood up again. That winter, I cleared James's clothes from the closet and gave them to charity. I kept the house, the company, and the name. But I reclaimed the part of me that had been sleeping for years. I wasn't the wife who was left behind. I was the woman who stayed. And I was just getting started. Winter melted into spring, and with it, the last remnants of the life I once had with James. The fireplace he never used became my favorite corner of the house. I had the walls repainted, the curtains changed. The heavy furniture he insisted on buying, the ones that looked important, I sold. I kept the pieces that mattered to me, the ones I chose, the ones that weren't just trophies to impress visitors. The home that had always been a monument to his success finally began to feel like mine. And I began to live. For the first time in decades, I wasn't waking up to serve someone else's agenda. I wasn't packing lunches, preparing dinner plans, coordinating holiday schedules, or adjusting myself around someone else's ego. I started writing again, nothing serious, just small essays, journal entries, thoughts that had been buried under years of silence. Words flowed out of me like a second heartbeat. It was as if the person I used to be was crawling back out from beneath 50 years of being someone's wife. At the company, the changes were swift but strategic. I didn't want to be the new dictator. I wanted to be the woman who brought the heart back. The first thing I did was set up a leadership mentorship program. For women, especially the ones who sat quietly in meetings and never interrupted. I knew those women. I had been one of them. I watched them bloom in just a few weeks, pitching ideas, proposing strategies, standing taller in rooms that once swallowed them whole. I replaced the oversized, hyper-aggressive marketing campaign James had approved with a more thoughtful, community-driven initiative. It cost us less and earned us more respect. Internally, employee retention improved within 2 months. Morale lifted. People started stopping by my office just to chat. The walls that James had spent years fortifying were finally being torn down, and no one missed them. Francis and I began the final phase of the transition. We restructured the leadership roles and began grooming a successor, not because I planned to leave, but because I wanted to build something sustainable. Something that didn't depend on any one man. I wasn't running the company for legacy anymore. I was running it for impact. And yet, there were quiet moments when I thought of James. I wondered if he ever sat in his dim apartment and asked himself where it all went wrong. I wondered if he had realized, finally, what he had thrown away. I wondered if he had learned anything at all. But I didn't dwell. I had stopped mourning the man I thought he was. That man, the young dreamer who held my hand in the rain, who kissed my forehead before a pitch meeting, who whispered promises into my ear at midnight. He was long gone. What remained was a man who couldn't handle being second to a woman, even if that woman had been his wife. Then, one morning, an envelope arrived. It was hand-delivered, thick, expensive paper, James's style. The return address was his lawyer's. Inside was a letter. Not an apology, not really. A proposal. James wanted a buyout. He had realized he couldn't claw back control, and now he wanted to sell his shares and walk away for good. The price he named was high, ridiculously high, but it was a number based on ego, not reality. A last act of bravado. One more attempt to posture. I sat in my office and stared at the letter for a long time. Then I made a call. Frances laughed when she saw the number. "Is he serious?" "Of course he is," I replied. "He's still pretending to be powerful. So, what do you want to do?" "I want to remind him what power actually looks like." We countered. Not just with a lower offer, but with terms that made it clear. This was a favor, not a concession. The shares would be bought through a female-led investor group I had secretly founded 2 years ago. One James had mocked during a board meeting as a charity for women in blazers. That comment had burned back then. Now it just fueled me. The deal was finalized within a month. James was officially out. No seat on the board. No voting rights. No more company card. No more secretaries. Just a check, and a quiet, paper-bound goodbye. The day the final documents were signed, I had lunch on the terrace with my sons. David toasted me with sparkling water. Marcus had tears in his eyes. He tried to blink away. They had grown up watching their father tower over the house. Now they saw their mother stand taller. Later that evening, I drove past the building where Vanessa used to work. It was closed. She'd moved on, apparently. Rumor had it she was trying to start a wellness brand with money she didn't have. The last I heard, she had gone back to school. It didn't matter. She was never the point. This was never about her. It was about me. About the girl who had once scrubbed stains from the floor of a tiny studio apartment while her husband dreamed out loud. The girl who wore the same black dress to every event because it was all she could afford. The woman who raised 2 sons and a company at the same time, all while pretending her needs didn't matter. Now, my needs did matter. And I was just starting to understand how powerful that realization was. In the quiet of that spring night, I sat by the fireplace once more, this time with no sadness, no lingering pain. Just stillness. Peace. I was no longer the woman he left. I was the woman he could never come back to. The summer arrived slowly, as if the world itself had decided to give me time to breathe. Time to process, to reflect, to rebuild. Not just the spaces James had vacated, but the ones I had neglected in myself. The garden began to bloom again, the hydrangeas stubbornly refusing to wilt despite a late spring frost. I found comfort in their resilience. I started waking up before the alarm, sometimes even before sunrise, just to sit on the back porch and let the quiet wrap around me. It wasn't the same kind of silence I had known after James left. That silence had been jagged, painful, like glass underfoot, sharp, invisible, always unexpected. This new silence was softer, deliberate. The kind that made room for thoughts, for clarity, for joy. I found myself smiling at small things again. The way the wind rustled through the trees. The sound of my neighbor's grandkids laughing in the yard next door. I even began to laugh again. Really laugh, from the belly. It was like rediscovering a language I hadn't spoken in years. The company thrived without James. In fact, it flourished. Once his outdated strategies and ego-driven decisions were out of the way, innovation flowed like a river breaking through a dam. The new leadership team I had assembled, diverse, sharp, driven, took ownership with pride. We launched initiatives focused on environmental sustainability and employee well-being. We partnered with local universities to mentor young entrepreneurs. The press caught on quickly, and the headlines shifted. No longer logistics giant rebuilds after CEO's departure, but Margaret Davis leads quiet revolution in corporate culture. Every time I saw my name in print, I felt something stir in my chest. Not pride exactly. More like rightness. As though the universe had finally tilted back into alignment. Of course, there were people who didn't understand. Some board members had quietly questioned my approach at first. Gentler leadership, flatter hierarchies, mental health days, collaborative decision-making. But the results spoke for themselves. Revenue climbed. Employee retention rates hit a 10-year high. Clients who had once felt like numbers now felt like partners. And I felt whole. But life isn't a clean line from pain to peace. Healing, I learned, is messy. Non-linear. Some nights I still heard echoes, his voice calling from the hallway, the sound of a suitcase being zipped, the silence after he said, "I'm leaving you for her." Those moments would creep in like shadows, unexpected and cold. But now, I didn't fear them. I sat with them. Let them pass. They had less power each time. One afternoon, nearly a year to the day since he left, James called again. The number was familiar, but not one I had saved. I answered, more curious than anything else. His voice was thinner, quieter than I remembered. "Margaret," he said, "I hope this isn't a bad time." "It is," I said, not cruelly, just honestly. "But go ahead." There was a pause. "I just wanted to say, I've been watching the company. You've done well. Better than I expected." I waited. "And I've been thinking a lot," he continued. "About us. About everything. I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted to say I was wrong." The words didn't land the way he probably hoped. They didn't feel triumphant or healing. They felt late. Like a letter that arrives years after it was needed. "I know," I said quietly. "You were wrong. But I already forgave you." "You did?" "Yes. Because holding on to it gave you too much space in my life. I didn't want to hate you, James. I just wanted you to see me. And you never really did." "I'm sorry, Margaret." "I know." There was a silence between us. One final thread of connection unraveling gently. "I hope you're doing well," he said after a long moment. "I am," I replied. "I really, truly am." And with that, we ended the call. I didn't cry. I didn't shake. I simply placed the phone down and exhaled. That night, I went through the last box I had packed away when he left. It was full of old letters, anniversary cards, ticket stubs from concerts we had attended in our 20s, receipts from the first couch we ever bought together. I sifted through them one by one, and for the first time, I didn't feel bitterness. There had been love there. Real love. But love doesn't always last. And sometimes, it leaves long before the person does. I kept a few things. Not because I wanted to remember him, but because I wanted to remember me. The woman who loved without condition. The woman who sacrificed without complaint. The woman who survived, adapted, rebuilt. The woman who rose. A few weeks later, I was invited to speak at a women's leadership conference in New York. I hesitated at first. Public speaking was never my strength, but something inside me said go. So I did. I walked onto that stage, looked out at a sea of women, young, old, in business suits and headscarves and jeans, and told my story. Not the scandalized version that tabloids loved, but the real version. About building something from nothing. About trusting the wrong man for too long. About losing everything you thought defined you, and finding out you were the definition all along. When I finished, the room erupted in applause. But more than the clapping, it was the eyes of the women in that room that stayed with me. Eyes that said, "I see you. I am you." Afterward, a young woman approached me. She couldn't have been older than 25. She said, "You're the woman I want to become one day." And I smiled. Not with pride. With peace. Because the woman I had become wasn't born the day James walked out. She had been there all along. Waiting. Watching. Planning. Preparing. And now she stood tall, unshaken, unbroken, undeniable. Not just the woman he left behind. But the woman he could never reach again. Not even in his dreams.